Hello everyone, it's me, Clayton. I just got back from watching mid90s, directed and written by Jonah Hill and starring Sonny Suljic. Now, for those who don't know Sonny Suljic, he was actually the voice and motion capture person for Atreus from the new God of War video game. And I'm sure a lot of you know who Jonah Hill is. He said he learned how to become a writer from Sacha Baron Cohen. He had major roles in The Wolf of Wall Street, the 21 Jump Street movie, and Moneyball. And now this is, I believe, his debut as a director. So does he manage to transition from acting to directing well? Well, in some ways, in some ways he does, some ways he doesn't. But I'll tell you about the story first. The story in this movie takes place as the title suggests, in the mid 1990s, and it stars a 13-year-old boy named Stevie. Stevie has a pretty troubled life. He has an abusive older brother and a mother who isn't able to take care of him all the time, so he decides to hang out with a bunch of kids at the local skateboarding shop. And although these kids are quirky in their own ways, they happen to form actual bonds of camaraderie and friendship with him. And most of the movie shows Stevie getting along with these people despite their juvenile and delinquent ways, and him getting into a bunch of conflicts with the local law enforcement, his family, and these friends as they constantly have him go into a life of reckless indulgence. And that's all I'll say about the story without spoiling anything, but one thing that I think the film does really well is that even though it is a film about reckless indulgence where there is a ton of content that should not be seen by younger viewers, there's several bits of drug and alcohol use, there's violence, there's tons of cursing with racial and homophobic slurs. There's a lot of that stuff, and a lot of it done by teenage characters. But to me, I think it adds to the realism of the story. I don't think it's meant to offend, it's more meant to just present a time and a place to an audience where the stuff was more readily available and readily accessible. To enjoy this film, you need to put away your sort of modern lens and just look at it in a different lens. And when you do it that way, I actually think the way the film is written and the way the film is acted is pretty effective because it feels real in a way. I know that's not a very in-depth way of looking at it, but that's just the only word that comes to mind. It just feels like it's an actual way that these types of characters would speak and the ways they would think. And the film also manages to embrace its 1990s aesthetic in other ways, including several references and several shows of popular culture, like it shows bed sheets of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Super Nintendos. It's clear that Jonah Hill, the writer and director of the film, has a love for the 1980s and 1990s. And a lot of that love is shown throughout this film, especially in the soundtrack, which I thought the soundtrack would get distracting after a little while, but even when the songs have lyrics, I don't think they detract from the movie at all. They happen to set the mood of certain scenes, they happen to fit certain moments, and it feels like the soundtrack's always moving through these songs that are fitting for these scenarios, except for the times when it needs to slow down, when it needs to be silent, and when it needs to, just be quiet for the sake of the dramatic moments. And the movie pulls them off pretty well too. The rest of the movie is so full of explicit content that the few times when it does slow down and it does finally go for drama, it makes it very effective. It feels earned that way. And there are certain scenes that don't even have any music or any audio at all. It just lets the uncomfortable energy or emotional moments sink in. And in my opinion, that's a really good way to handle your soundtrack. Now, it's clear that this film is not going to be for everyone. With the amount of explicit content, a lot of it revolving around characters who are not adults, and there's even a few scenarios that have sexual content. Thankfully, there's nothing shown, but it's heavily implied, and it basically does happen, but it's not shown on screen. And there are several moments involving alcohol and drugs, as well as the fact that there are so many moments that wouldn't fly today if the film was set in modern day. I understand why certain people wouldn't enjoy this film. But as a first directorial effort to create a film that speaks to an audience that grew up in the mid-90s and that happens to take place in the mid-90s with this kind of character study, I personally think it does handle it fairly well. So I'll give mid-90s an 8 out of 10. Good job, Jonah Hill. See you next time.